Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I appreciate you being with me here on NowTV. It's always really a joy to be able to share my understanding as a student of the Bible of end-time prophecy and to try to demonstrate the proper hermeneutic, exercise proper exegesis, to understand the biblical story and to show we are not living in the last days. Now, I want you to think about that, okay? Let me illustrate. Some years ago, I was in the audience listening to a dispensational speaker. And that man went to Revelation 14, and he described in horrific detail his vision of the yet future fulfillment of that great battle in which Jesus comes out of heaven and he tramples down his enemies with his feet, and blood comes up to the horses' bridles. Now, this individual never ever explained how it would be, why it would be that in some yet future battle, the armies would be on horses. And yet, he took it for granted that at some point in the future, I guess it's the Battle of Armageddon, Jesus comes out of heaven and stomps. Now, this gentleman's words were, with his own 2 feet. You see, he sees Jesus as still a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body, instead of being King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But nonetheless, in such graphic detail, he talked about it, and he says, do you know how many people it would take for Jesus to kill with his own feet in order to make blood flow up to horses' bridles? Oh, it was unbelievable, literally so, to hear his graphic description. And then he added this, and he said, do you know what the really, really good news is about this whole scenario? He paused. And he said, finally, I get to watch. Really? This is supposed to be good news? But you see, ladies and gentlemen, what I've been sharing with you here on Now TV for well over a year is that the Bible teaches emphatically, very, very powerfully, we are not in the last days. If you remember, last week I shared with you Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, prophecy of the last days. And what would happen in the last days? The day of the Lord, when the Lord would come and shake the earth mightily, verses 9 and 10, verses 19 to 21. And that is the day of the Lord being foretold by Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3, who is talking about the last days and the day of the Lord and the destruction of creation. So we have two great prophecies of the last days. Now here's the kicker, here's the key. Peter said that he was reiterating the Old Testament prophets and that he was living in the days that they foretold, as I've already demonstrated in several videos. What the Old Testament prophets said would happen in the last days concerning the scoffers in 2 Peter chapter 2 and in the book of Jude, we are told very powerfully, very clearly that those scoffers were present, they were working in the first century. Now, it doesn't say, well, the scoffers are going to appear and they're going to work for over 2,000 years. No. The scoffers would be present and they would be slain at the day of the Lord. Thus, for Peter and for Jude to affirm that those scoffers were alive in the first century means that the coming of the Lord was to be in the first century. Now, guess what? Let's continue our examination of Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. Now remember, we are discussing the challenge of Christ. The challenge of Christ is, do not believe me, Jesus said, for my word's sake. Believe me for my works. If I do not do the works that the Father has given me, do not believe me. I've shared with you that I have spoken with any number of people from time to time, and they are wonderful people. They are believers. But when you ask them, why are you a Christian? Or why are you a member of this denomination or that denomination? They literally have that deer in the headlight look and say, I don't know how to answer that. Listen to me, ladies and gentlemen, and please listen carefully. And obviously, I mean no disrespect to anyone. Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart, and be ready always to give an answer and a reason for the hope that lies within you, with fear and godliness. Now, when Peter says to give an answer, that's from the Greek word apologia. And no, Peter wasn't saying, hey, I want you to be ready to apologize for believing in Jesus. No. The word apologia in the Greek, used in the first century, means a legal defense, a logical legal defense. In other words, Peter is writing in a context, 1 Peter chapter 1, 4 and following, in which they were being persecuted for their faith. They were being brought before kings and councils and Sanhedrins and said, why in the world do you believe in Jesus? They were being asked to meet the challenge of Christ. Why do you believe in Jesus? And Peter said, you need to sanctify Christ in your heart, and you need to be able to explain. Now listen, you may not be a lawyer. You may not be a trained logician. You may not be a trained, quote, apologist, unquote. You may not be a great debater. But you should, as a believer in Jesus, be able to explain and to give the evidence for why you believe in Jesus. And listen, saying, well, I'm a Christian today because, you know what, my grandma and grandpa and their grandma and grandpa and their grandma and grandpa, they were all Christians. And they all believe the same thing, and they all belong to the same church. Again, ladies and gentlemen, with all due respect, that is not a reason to be a Christian. Christianity is an evidentiary religion. We are supposed to know, and again, we don't have to be a world-class scholar to do this, folks. But we need to be willing to read and to study and to research, to garner the evidence that we can present to others, to tell them why we are Christians, and to meet the challenge of Christ when we are confronted by unbelievers who reject Jesus as the Son of God, who reject the Bible as the Son of God. Jesus said he was coming back in the first century with his angels in judgment before that first century generation passed away. Do you accept what he said? Can you prove that he kept his word? Or are you like so many people and you say, well, hey, look, I know he didn't come. I was sitting in a Bible class being taught by an elder of the church where I was a minister years and years ago. Wonderful, godly man. And he was teaching on Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And in that passage, verse 15 and verse 17, Paul twice affirmed, now, we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who are asleep. And this elder went across those verses and he said, now, it's real plain that Paul expected the Lord to come in the first century. Now, we all know he didn't do it. And that's really troublesome, but we know he'll come one day. I sat there and I raised my hand. And again, you know, this elder and I were wonderful friends, as well as him being an elder and leader of the congregation. I raised my hand and I said, brother, can we stop and think about what you just said? And he goes, why? What did I say? I said, well, you said that we understand that Paul believed that Jesus was coming back in his generation, but you said he didn't do it. And I called his name. I said, brother, if Paul said he was coming back in that generation, and if he didn't do it, what does that make Paul? And he stopped, stood there in front of this class, and he said, well, you know, this is something I've struggled with for an awful long time. And he said, I don't have the answer for it. And I began to give a little bit of an exposition. And at the end of my very, very brief exposition and explanation, he said, you know what? That just makes an awful lot of sense. And so we went right on. I wasn't going to argue, you know, and I wasn't going to be disruptive. But listen, ladies and gentlemen, this is the challenge of Christ. Have you heard your preacher get up and say, now we all know Jesus in the New Testament said the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, the end of the age was going to be in the first century. And of course we know it didn't happen. Listen, my own father used to go to Matthew 24, 29 to 31. And the description, they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And the Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they shall gather together the elect from the four winds. Verse 34, this generation will not pass until all of these things are fulfilled. And I heard my own father say, I know that it says he was coming in that generation. It didn't happen. I do not know how to explain it. And of course, that was in the years long before I ever discovered the truth that he did come, that he kept his word. Here was my own father, unable to answer the challenge of Christ, even though he was, in my estimation at the time, an excellent Bible student. Oh, he was perplexed. And we all should be challenged by the challenge of Christ. So I've been sharing with you week after week how we can answer the challenge of Christ. We can see that Jesus promised to return not as a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body. He promised to come, quote, in the glory of the Father, which means he was promising that he was going to come back or come as the Father had come. I have demonstrated to you in passage after passage that the Father came many, many times in the Old Testament. And yet he never came literally, visibly, or bodily out of heaven. And Jesus said he was going to come in that same way. He was going to come in judgment in the same way that he had seen the Father come in judgment. John 5:21 and following. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the only way we can meet the challenge of Christ. Now, I shared with you last week, and I hope, I hope that you caught the power of where we left off last week. Now remember, Isaiah 2 through 4 is a united discourse. In Isaiah chapter 2, we're going to read some of these verses again. We are talking about in the last days. Enter into the rock, verse 10, and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty. The lofty looks of man shall be humbled, the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. For the day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty. Now keep in mind, folks, this is the day of the Lord of the last days that Peter's talking about in 2 Peter chapter 3. The same day of the Lord. Okay? So if Peter was anticipating the fulfillment of the last day's day of the Lord, then if we can affirm, if we can demonstrate, if we can prove that the day of the Lord foretold by Isaiah was not an earth-burning, time-ending event in which Jesus, as a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body, would come out of heaven, then that means that 2 Peter chapter 3 was not predicting an end of time, earth-burning event in which Jesus would come as a 5'5" Jewish man riding on a cloud out of heaven. Do you follow that? Okay. So here's the day of the Lord. Now watch this. Verse 19. And keep in mind, we are told that the day of the Lord is over. Boom! In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. Okay? They shall go into the holes of the rocks, into the caves of the earth, from the terror of the Lord, from the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake the earth mightily. See, here's the day of the Lord for the destruction of creation. This is 2 Peter chapter 3. Wait a minute. Look closer. Verse 20. In that day a man will cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they have made, each for himself to worship, to the moles and to the bats, to go into the clefts of the rocks, into the crags of the rugged rocks, from the terror of the Lord and from the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake the earth mightily. Now, do you remember what I said last week? Keep in mind one more time. We are told the day of the Lord at the end of the last days is over. Boom. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. Remember 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Well, if Isaiah is predicting the last day's day of the Lord as an earth-burning, time-ending event, and it's over in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, then how could anybody run to the hills, have the time to find a cave, and hide in it, and say to the mountains, fall on us, hide us from the day of the Lord? Would there be any escape from that earth-burning, time-ending event that would be over in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye? Would there be any possibility of escaping it? Would there be any possibility of running to the hills? You know there wouldn't. I mean, before you can even turn around, it's over. Here's something you need to know. This language of running to the hills, hiding in the rocks, hiding in the caves, is typical Old Testament language to describe a time of national judgment in which enemies were invading the land, destroying cities, killing, pillaging. And those who were able to escape it would run to the hills. We find an example of this in Judges chapter 6, in which the enemies of God, the enemies of Israel, were invading the land. So what did the inhabitants of the land do? Well, Judges chapter 6 verse 2 says they ran to the hills. They hid in the rocks. They hid in the caves. Yeah. You see, folks, once again, this is a classic example of how we need to familiarize ourselves with the language, with the thought, with the idioms, even the euphemisms of the Old Testament language, the Old Testament world. This is not talking about some future event in which we have, all of our high-powered cars and technology like computers. Folks, this is typical warfare language. And if we ignore that context, if we ignore that background, we will misunderstand, and as a result of that, we will misinterpret. This day of the Lord, this last day's day of the Lord, which is the last day's day of the Lord of 2 Peter chapter 3, is a time, once again, when men, just like at other times of national invasion, national warfare, could escape by running to the hills. Let me reiterate, look, this is so critically important. And by the way, I develop all of this and I discuss all of this in my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, because I demonstrate the correlation, the relationship between 2 Peter chapter 3 and Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. And I show that that language of running to the hills, hiding in the rocks and the caves, is typical Old Testament language, typical Old Testament thought for trying to escape national warfare, national invasion. And just the very nature of the description of that day, remember, running to the hills, hiding in the caves, hiding in the rocks, absolutely removes any possibility that Isaiah, or therefore 2 Peter 3, is talking about an end of the literal world event. Failure, the utter failure of most biblical commentators to honor this, what German scholars called the Setz in Leben. Setz in Leben. And that means the real life situation. We might call it audience relevance, that I've talked about on this show over and over and over again. To ignore that audience relevance, to ignore the social, political, geopolitical, military context, language, literature, expressions of this language right here, forces us, when we ignore that, it will almost invariably mean we are misinterpreting the Bible. That's why I share with you. Sometimes I go into depth, and yes, sometimes I repeat myself. But you know the best way that we learn? Repetition, repetition, repetition. And so I'm hoping to familiarize you, my audience, with the audience relevance of these Old Testament prophecies that are the source of the New Testament prophecies of the day of the Lord in the last days. So, when we read in Isaiah chapter 2 about the last days, day of the Lord, and the description is borrowed from times of national invasion, national warfare, then the question arises, how is it that we go to this language And we say, well, yeah, in its other occurrences, it was talking about national invasion when people would flee from an invading army, they'd run to the hills. And by the way, when David was fleeing Saul, what did he do? He ran to the hills and he hid in the caves. That's right. So again, the hermeneutical question is, when we read that language of what happened at the time of national invasion, and then we come to this text in Isaiah, and we read that identical language, upon what hermeneutical principle do we say? Well, yes, in all of those other instances, that language describes a time of national judgment. But here, it's talking about a time-ending, earth-burning event at the day of the Lord, and yet that forces us to explain, okay, if this is an earth-burning, time-ending event, then how could people flee to the mountains? To escape an event that would be over in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. Do you see the problems? Do you see the necessity for understanding the proper historical context, that Zetz in Leben, that audience relevance? Instead of just saying, as I was raised believing, hey, this is talking about the day of the Lord. Oh my goodness, and it's talking about the last days. We're in the last days. Oh my goodness, that's got to be talking about the end of the current Christian age. And never stop to think. Never stop to think. If this is talking about the end of the current Christian age, which, as I came to learn, the Christian age, the current age, has no end. So how could I propose in my own mind, how could I believe Isaiah chapter 2 is talking about the day of the Lord at the end of the current endless Christian age? Well, guess what? It can't. And you know what? I'm out of time, so I'll continue next week. See you there.